So, David versus Goliath. It's a battle and a victory that's been talked about for thousands of years. Even today, we've heard and told this story over and over again, ever since we were little kids. So much so that I think that we kind of take for granted just how gutsy David was. We really don't understand the full point of this story anymore. We've just heard it so many times, David and Goliath, David and Goliath. We've heard it over and over and over, so much so that I don't think that we really get it anymore. I think you can hear something so often that you kind of start missing the whole point. You really don't understand what it means anymore. It loses all its meaning. So to help you kind of understand, to put yourself in David's shoes, I have this is going to be my Goliath this morning. This guy is up there 10 feet, right? I'm 6'2", almost 6'3". David was probably down here. That is 10 foot tall. That is huge. So I hope you're starting to understand how big Goliath was compared to how little David was. David had a very unconventional way that he approached giants. Something we usually miss completely in this passage, but it's the whole point of the story. First, David ran toward the giant. 1 Samuel 17:48, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. He didn't just face his giant, he attacked his Goliath. Now, usually we run away from our giants. We try ignoring them because we're afraid of them. So we try to pretend that they don't exist. So we procrastinate facing our giant problems. We try to ignore them. For 40 days, the Israelites, they tried to ignore Goliath, but he didn't go away. He just came out every day, bigger and stronger, more confident every day. In verse 16, it says, for 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and evening, and he took his stand. He came out every day with the same challenge: fight me. When you try to ignore your problems, they don't go away. They just get bigger and bigger. We all face our own Goliaths. For some of you today, it might be the giant of financial problems. For some of you, it might be the giant of addiction. You just can't seem to break out of it. Or maybe it's the giant of divorce. You went into marriage, you could have never imagined, you think it was going to last forever, you could have never dreamed that today you would be facing this giant. Or maybe for you it's the giant of depression. You just can't seem to shake it. Or maybe it's the giant of anxiety, or the giant of fear, or the giant of loneliness, the giant of doubt. We all face our own Goliaths. And usually we run from them. David didn't run from his giant. He not only faced his giant, he attacked his Goliath. That's the kind of faith I want. We're going to see how David had that kind of faith. But another unconventional way that he approached giants was that David possessed a killer instinct. He finished the job. Instead of celebrating, he did something else. In verse 51, it says, David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. David had killer instinct. Many times we face the same giant over and over again. We get a little victory and we start doing victory laps and we get a little complacent. We never cut off the head of the problem. We just don't have that killer instinct. We might knock our giant down, and then while we're over here doing victory laps, he's like a bad horror movie. He just keeps getting back up. Some of you are facing the same giant today that you've been facing for the last 10 or 20 years. You've got the same issues in your relationships. You've got the same issues in your finances. You've got the same issues in your character. You've got the same sin that you're trying to get the victory over. You're facing that same giant over and over again, and God says that it's time to slay that giant. It's time to cut off the head of that giant. That's the kind of faith I want. A faith that has killer instinct. Here's the other thing, though. David expected more giants in the future. Once you kill that same old giant, just know that there will be more giants coming in the future. That's just the way it is. Now, at least it's a different giant. It's not the same problem, the same stress that you had before. It's a different one, but there are always giants. Look here in verse 40. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Why do you think David chose 5 stones? Was he afraid that he would miss the first 4 times? Did he have a lack of faith? Why did he choose 5 stones? Well, we're really not told, but we do find out later in Scripture that Goliath had 4 brothers. So maybe David was ready to take on the whole family. Maybe he thought, if they come after me, I'm going to be ready. He was prepared to face more giants in the future. In life, there will always be giants. Usually when we slay a giant that we've been dealing with for a long time, it might be tempting to think, well, now life is just going to be perfect. Everything is just going to be great now because I got rid of that giant that had been bothering me for so long. Everything is just going to be perfect now. But giants always have brothers. David had a faith that said, bring it on. He was ready for whatever life would bring his way. But then there's another unconventional approach that he had towards giants. He turned down a sword for a sling. David refused armor and went out to fight the giant with a homemade slingshot. Why? Verse 47 tells us that David said to Goliath, all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Now, I want you to notice there that David took 0 credit in his own ability there. But I just want to let you know that I would guess that David was very proficient and very confident in his ability with this slingshot. We find out in later scriptures that there were whole troops in the military dedicated to these snipers. It says that they could hit a hare at great distance with their sling. So I bet David was pretty confident in his ability. But notice that David didn't say anything of the sort. David said, basically, I have a powerful God on my side. Too many times I try to face my giants. Got this perfect little plan that I've put together, and I say, God, would you bless my perfect plan? This plan is going to help me get rid of this problem. Too many times I say, God, I've got this. I got a plan, and I've got my abilities. And like any good father, he allows me to struggle and even fail sometimes. God's like, all you got to do is ask, son. The battle is the Lord's. The secret to slaying giants is not a perfect weapon, but a powerful God. David knew he had a powerful God on his side. But probably the most unconventional thing about this whole story was David wasn't even a warrior. Goliath was a battle-hardened warrior who had been in the army since he was a little boy. And I guess by little boy, I'm thinking he was my height when he was David's age. Thousands upon thousands of men in the Israelite army, they were bigger, they were stronger, more talented and more experienced than David. And yet David is the only one who stepped forward. A teenage boy stepped forward to face Goliath in an ultimate death match. Out of all the thousands that were there, why was David the only one that stepped forward? This is really the key to the whole story. When you think about it, why was David the only one? How did he have that kind of faith and courage to be the only one out of thousands, way more qualified to step forward and face this giant? The answer is found in the next verse, and it's the key to the whole story. When David goes before King Saul, Saul, who should have been the one to fight Goliath, Saul, who at one time was following God, but now is going in the complete opposite direction. Here's what he says to David in verse 33. You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. Now, Saul's kind of right here. What David's doing is ridiculous. If you would have been there, you would have said the same thing. David, don't be ridiculous. Be reasonable. If you would have been David's parent, you would have said, David, stop being ridiculous. Be reasonable. He's going to tear you apart. I can't let you do it. The world says, be reasonable. Don't be ridiculous. Saul and the army of Israel were operating on the basis of faith, on the basis of reason. David was operating on the basis of faith. When you're operating on the basis of reason, you might say, look at how big Goliath is. When you're operating on the basis of faith, you would say, look at how small Goliath is compared to how great God is. When you're operating on the basis of reason, you say, he's too big to hit. I'm not messing with him. When you're operating on the basis of faith, you say, he's too big to miss. The one thing that separated David from all the other thousands that were there that day was one thing: ridiculous faith. Let me humbly suggest that the only thing that will slay every giant in your life is ridiculous faith. The only way that you can slay the giants that you're facing today is with ridiculous faith. And fortunately, this passage shows us 3 steps to ridiculous faith. If I put these 3 things into my life, I can have the same faith that David had. If you put these principles into your life, you too can have ridiculous faith just like David had. David's ridiculous heart of faith, it started out first of all in secret. Ridiculous faith always starts out in secret. David was the youngest of his brothers. When Samuel went to David's home to find the next king, David's father Jesse didn't even bother bringing David into the house. David was out tending the sheep. You see that in 1 Samuel 16:6. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons that you have? Well, they're still the youngest, Jesse answered. He's tending the sheep. Samuel sends for David. So he sent for him and had him brought in. David, he was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. And then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. This boy, whose job was to care for the sheep, was to be the next king. Why? His brothers were the ones that were in all the action. They were the one in Saul's army. But David was relegated to obscurity with the sheep out in the middle of nowhere. But it was on those lonely nights where there was no one else to talk to but God. That's where his ridiculous faith started to form. Because ridiculous faith is always formed in a secret place. David began to understand that. That's why in Psalm 91 he wrote, because he loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He will call on me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. It was in David's heart, in secret, that his ridiculous faith started to form. And it was solidified the day that Samuel showed up at David's home. It was in those lonely nights where there was no one else to listen to him but God. When no one else seemed to care, he learned how much God cared. When no one else seemed to know where he was, there were times where David was just out in those fields and he might have thought to himself, well, no one in the world knows where I am right now. If something were to happen to me, no one would know. They wouldn't know where to find me because no one knows exactly where I am. And that's when he discovered that God knew where he was. The second thing is ridiculous faith crashes through criticism. Ridiculous faith crashes through criticism. When you have a ridiculous faith, Someone will point it out to you. Whenever you have ridiculous faith, there will always be critics. David was criticized by his own brother. Look at this next verse, verse 28. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger and asked him, Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. So he accuses him of just wanting to see the blood and gore. He totally misunderstands David's motives. But notice that David doesn't even focus on his brother. Now, what have I done? Said David. Can't I even speak? He turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. And the man answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. He just ignores his brother and moves on, because David kept his eyes on the real giant. He gets criticized again by the king. Saul replied, You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. And again, David kept his eyes on the real enemy. Too many times in life, we let our critics get us distracted. David was listening to God while keeping his eyes on the real enemy, Goliath. He didn't get distracted by the critics. The third thing is ridiculous faith is powered by perspective. It's powered by perspective. This is the key. Now remember, David is going against this 9'9", we'll call it 10-foot Goliath, this gargantuan of a human being. He's standing there face to face with Goliath. Goliath is in full armor. He's got this huge spear in his hand and his faith in his own ability, which is quite significant. And David is standing there, thousands watching. His faith in God on display for all to see. It's the ultimate death match. Goliath is getting ready to attack. How would you feel? Put yourself in David's shoes. You know, if I was in David's shoes, and I somehow had enough faith to step out there, out of all the thousands to face Goliath, I think that I would probably say, God, I've done a pretty good job so far, right? You know, I mean, I'm here, and my knees are knocking together, and I'm shaking in my boots, and I kind of want to run. At least I did this. And if I didn't run, at least I'd be going, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I'm here. How would you feel? This is what Goliath said to David. Now again, put yourself in David's shoes. You're standing right there. You're facing Goliath. And Goliath says this to you, some real comforting words. It says, the Philistine, with his shield bare in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Very comforting words. How would that make you feel? I mean, it would take everything within me to just stay there. But what does David do? And this is the miracle of the whole story. This is why God chose David. This is what we miss when we tell this story. We miss it over and over again. The courage of David. The amazing, ridiculous faith and courage of David, because David wasn't shaking in his boots. His knees weren't knocking together. He wasn't tempted to run. Here's what he said right back to Goliath. And I'd like to think that David had a little smirk on his face as he said it, because David knew. David and God were like this. They were tight. They were so close. That's why David's described as a man after God's own heart. They had this beautiful relationship. Man, I want that. David says, You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. That is ridiculous faith. A teenage boy staring down a 9'9" tall giant and saying, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to cut off your head. That's ridiculous faith. Now, how in the world did David have the courage to say this to Goliath? One reason. He had a God-level perspective. Most of us live life from the ground level. We have a ground level perspective, and when giants come our way, they fill up our whole screen. We can't see over them, we can't see around them, and we can't see through them. It's just a giant, and we're looking at it from the ground level. So the giant consumes our every thought. It consumes us. We worry about that giant because our every waking thought is about that giant that we see right in front of us from the ground level. Most of us live life from the ground level. But David was living life from a God level. From a God level perspective, Goliath looked like a little ant. So David was really the only one being reasonable because he was looking at life from a God level perspective, the only true perspective. While everyone else was looking at life from the ground level perspective, a skewed perspective, so everyone else was the one being ridiculous. David was the only one being reasonable. Everyone else looked at this giant and said, he's huge. We can't see anything else. We need to run. They were paralyzed by fear. David looked at the giant from a God-level perspective. He looked like a little shrimp, like a little thumbprint. When he was looking at life from the right perspective, he knew that the God who created the universe and all the stars in the heavens that he wrote about in the Psalms, the God who created Goliath, the God who could snuff out his life. David was looking at life from a God-level perspective, and that is the secret to slaying giants, to having ridiculous faith. When you look at life from a God-level perspective, then your giants can become really small. For some of you today, you're facing the biggest giant of your life. It's taking up your whole screen. It's because you're looking at it from the ground level. You walked in here with that giant consuming your thoughts. But you know you can walk out of here looking at life from God's perspective. You're going to see that giant that's been bothering you and harassing you and causing you to lose sleep. It's nothing in God's eyes. And he can slay that giant for you. But you have to remember, it starts in secret. David spent time with God in secret. Do you have a secret place where you can go and get away with God and just you and God? Maybe for you it's the back porch, or maybe taking a walk in the woods, or, I don't know, climbing a tree or something. I don't know. Place where you can just go and get away. A secret place where you can be filled with God's conscience and his love. And you can talk to God and you can listen to him speak to you, to your heart, in that secret place. That's where your ridiculous faith will be formed. And then you're going to get criticism, but you have to crash through that criticism. And then you come to a place where you see life from God's perspective. When you look at life from a God level, all those giants will get really small. If you are here today and you're ready to, I don't know, maybe you've been facing this giant, whatever that might be, and you need some help. Maybe today's the day that you can allow God to help you with that. Begin looking at things from a God-level perspective. If you want to come forward today and give your life to Christ so that you can start to see life from that perspective, we want to invite you to do that. Would you stand with me as we close in prayer? Dear God, Lord, we thank you for this time that we had to gather together this morning. And God, I pray that we would all search our own hearts so that we can clearly see these giants that we face in life. We all have them. We can see them from your perspective and see that we can beat this with your help. We don't have to fight alone. Help us to not just hear those words that the battle is, Lord, but to live them and know that you can take care of it. Lord, we love you so much, and we thank you for all the many blessings you give to us.